So there's this recurring trend in Capcom titles from around the early aughts where they had this little issue where they, and stop me if you've heard this before, put a game that's supposed to be a simple, small, bite-sized experience into production and then forget that they have a very mechanically or thematically similar and much bigger release that happens to overshadow it completely. Like how PNO3 was overtaken by Resident Evil 4, this poor game had the bad luck of being a dark fantasy action title right after the launch of a little-known something you may have heard of named Devil May Cry 2. Now, you can tell me all you want how 2 was the weak link of the series, and I'd certainly agree. But what fan of the first game was talking about today's game, Chaos Legion, over it? Join me for a closer look, and maybe we can find out why. Greetings everyone, this is the hipster Snek, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2003 Capcom title, Chaos Legion. Launched for the PS2 in August and getting a PC port that same December, Chaos Legion is actually based on a novel by To Ubukata, which, if someone can confirm if this is available in the West or not, I'd really love to know. The story opens in November of 791 AS. Yes, AS, because this game is trying really hard to be edgy, so it's Anno Satanis. Then the Order of St. Overia sends out the knight Sieg Warheit after his former friend Victor Delacroix, who has stolen the forbidden Apocrypha of Yzark, a tome with the ability to summon Azrael, the Angel of Death, and bring an end to the world in all its parts. You guys have no idea how many times I had to re-record that one sentence because of all the pretentious European names in it, but that's neither here nor there. Now, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth because honestly, unless you're a huge Capcom nerd like myself, you won't play far enough in to learn much of this, so I'm just going to go ahead, okay? It turns out that, due to a misunderstanding, Victor holds Sieg responsible for the death of his lover Sela 3 years prior to the events of the game's story. We only get some out-of-context flashbacks early in the game about this. Eventually, Sieg reluctantly befriends Arcia, one of the Maidens of Silver, never explained, so don't ask, who travels alongside him due to Victor killing her brother for reasons that are also kind of unexplained. Kinda gives me the sense that the game was rushed through development, but more on this later. Graphically, the game is kind of muddy. It stays in this very brown and gray kind of color palette, and it never really bothers to try to get out of it. Sieg himself is likely the brightest flash of color you'll see in the game outside of most boss fights, being that he has this strong red motif fitting for a main character. And some of the bosses, as said, do break the mold and dare to have splashes of blues and reds peppered in, but on the whole, particularly when it comes to lesser mook enemies that spawn in large waves, they're all the same grays and browns. Heck, even the game's titular Chaos Legions kind of share this problem, being in that same washed-out color scheme. The overall level designs tend to be very samey as well, with a lot of reused assets and textures. While any one of these elements might very well look good in a vacuum, and generally they do, when you put it all together, everything just kinda blends together into this very dull, washed-out palette. In more than one case, I found myself inadvertently backtracking through the stage, wondering why there were no enemies, up until I would check my map and realize I was headed back to the start due to everything looking the same. And some late-game areas do buck this trend, but even then, it replaces a lot of the muddy browns with really muddy green. Dark fantasy can still be distinct, and even use colors other than black and brown, game devs. Sound-wise, the music is actually pretty good. It goes for that orchestral-sounding motif that a lot of dark fantasy tends to revel in, and I think it really works. It helps set up the stage for that whole gothic opera feeling that the plot's setting up for. And the sound effects are all pretty good. Sword-clashing sounds are impactful, meaningful, and the whistling sound of a soaring arrow is satisfying. And the voice cast, I wouldn't call it good voice acting, but I wouldn't call it terrible either. It sounds more like they weren't given a whole lot of direction, so some of the intonation just feels ever so slightly off. I think the voices on the whole do fit their characters, just that maybe they wanted for context or something. And yes, they do the whole faux ye old English dialect with egregious thous, these, and verilies, so for people who can't stand that, you have been properly warned. I don't necessarily mind it, it's just also not consistently enforced throughout, so it comes off as a little disjointed. But overall, I'd say the sound design is pretty good. Mechanically, Chaos Legion is a bit of a mixed bag. At its most basic level, the idea is just to get from point A to point B on the map and clear each subsequent stage. The overall map structure is essentially linear, dotted with open arenas throughout, a couple of traps here and there, all culminating in a boss fight. In that respect, its overall flow and design isn't too dissimilar from God Hand. However, that comparison evaporates when you consider the game's core mechanic, the legions. That's because Sieg, already a sword fighter in his own right, has effectively two modes he can fight in. The first being his default, where he is the sole attacker, and he gets full range of mobility, and the second being when he has a legion summoned and giving him AI-guided assistance, but prevents him from running and his melee combo is both weaker and shorter. So you either have to deal with all the enemies yourself or rely on the AI with decent, albeit not spectacular, pathfinding, and accept that you're hobbled in doing so. This is the game developers trying to balance the game mechanic and prevent the Legion from becoming the dominant strategy. But here's the problem. There's no reason in-universe why this trade-off should be happening. And since you get to do the tutorial level with the game's quote-unquote strongest Legion, Thanatos, and he's honestly quite terrible, it conditions the player to realize very quickly they're going to be on the back foot for the better part of their playtime. The Legions given to you stretch in numbers, especially as they have a stat that multiplies just how many of them you can summon at once, which, in a game where most enemies will just try to swarm you, makes them always the correct answer. Sieg doesn't need to be agile at all, he just needs a bunch of armed sword-fighting legionnaires around him doing the heavy lifting. So you just have Legion mode for combat, and then you turn off Legion mode to run to the next arena and repeat the process. The game tries to shake things up by letting you have two Legions on hand at any time and the ability to swap between them on the fly, and then introduces the mechanic that enemies fall into two categories, flesh and mechanical. Flesh-type enemies are weak to melee attacks, and mechanical ones are weak to ranged assaults, for no real reason. And since the sword and bow legions are the first two the game gives you anyway, they'll also be the ones that sponge up all that early game experience. And it's rather expensive to upgrade a legion even one step. So it means I ended up just choosing never to equip the other legions, interesting though they sounded. Maybe I made the game harder on myself than I needed to, given that some of them include the Agile Claw Legion or the Shield Legion, but powering them up felt like a chore, especially as the game itself isn't really all that long, relying on a New Game Plus mode to grind up the ones that ended up lagging behind. Which may also explain why that Thanatos Legion felt so weak in the tutorial, as it doesn't start with any of its upgrades. And that's another thing. Sieg himself doesn't get many abilities to his name. He has a sword, sure, but that's about it. He basically has one attack button, no inbuilt shield, barring the Shield Legion, and limited means by which to dodge. Explaining game feel is a challenging thing to do, but Sieg oftentimes felt stiff and sluggish. The thing that sets this apart from, say, PN03 was that dodging on command was just a given there, whereas Sieg generally needs to already be swiftly walking, his idea of running, away before an attack comes in if he wants to avoid the incoming damage. In fact, playing through the game actually made me think, yeah, this is the PS2's PN03. It may be a dark fantasy story, focused on melee ranged combat for the most part, and was made by a completely different team, but the similarities are somewhat uncanny. Kind of a clunky engine? Check. Prohibitively expensive upgrades that basically mandate use of the New Game Plus mode? Check. Underwritten story? Double check. The biggest difference was playing PN03 actually made me like it more. Revisiting Chaos Legion for the first time since high school kind of reminded me that the game was a very deeply flawed title. Now mind you, I'm not calling it a bad game. At its core, it's a perfectly serviceable hack and slash game, just one that wants desperately more for variety and a lot of polish. So, having said that, how does Chaos Legion stack up? It's an okay game that was absolutely cannibalized by having the unfortunate timing of coming out after another dark fantasy Capcom title and a sequel to one of their biggest hits, no less. If they had given it more time and ironed out the quirks, there's no doubt in my mind that Chaos Legion could have been something fantastic. Instead, it'll be left to languish behind in gaming history as a forgotten relic of what could have been. And the thing is, I really feel like it deserves better. If you have a curiosity for underrated titles, give it a try for yourselves. You might be surprised how fun it is, despite my concerns with it. And heck, if Capcom wanted a hero for Tekken to fill that niche of a black hero who is not also a villain, Sieg would work magnificently. There, I did my obligatory shtick. This has been the Chaos Snek, bringing to your attention another obscure bit of gaming history. What were your thoughts on this game? Have you played it before? Maybe you liked it more than I did. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment down below. And if you liked today's episode, hit the like button so I know. And for more like this each week, you can tap the subscribe and bell icon so you'll never miss a one. And join me here every week for Snek Plays, Obscure Reviews, and the new home of the Tomodachi Bros anime and movie podcast and more. And I will see you there.